Um, Welcome again. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Laura Ascenzi-Moreno. I'm a professor at Brooklyn College, and I am delighted to be here at IDRA's strand for Translanguaging for Social Justice. I want to thank the leadership at IDRA, especially Dr. Lisdelia Piñon, for inviting me and for thinking about this really important strand. So the first thing is it says we will begin soon. So in the chat, just share where you're from. Great. So we have people from San Antonio, from Los Altos, California. I'm so excited that you're excited to learn. Austin, Texas, Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm personally right now in New York City. Let's see where else. Dayton, Ohio, Guatemala, Fort Worth, Minneapolis. Wonderful. Jackson, Tennessee. Thank you. I'm in Brooklyn, New York. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Again, thank you so much for coming. My name is Laura Ascenzi-Moreno. You can see my Twitter handle there if you'd like to follow me. And let's begin. So today I'm presenting my journey as a teacher and as a teacher educator in understanding the assessment needs of emergent bilinguals. My work in academia and in colleges has always been aligned to teachers and the challenges that I found when I was a bilingual teacher and literacy coach. So I hope that in describing this journey, I can connect with some of the issues that you are experiencing in your particular context. So first, I'm going to begin this presentation with a story of the work in this picture. It's a picture of a running record kit in Spanish, and it's significant because of the power that running record kits hold in classrooms. For those of you who don't know, a running record kit is a collection of level texts that teachers use to assess students' reading, their reading levels and their comprehension. And the running record assessment holds potential to understand students' authentic reading. But kits like these are often only taken out when teachers are required to do assessments. So you can see the power these kits hold because sometimes when it's time to do these assessments, all the instruction in classrooms shift. I found unlike other literacy activities, when I engaged in implementing assessment, what was prioritized was my compliance. Therefore, I began to think about literacy assessment as the last frontier of teacher agency, especially when done with emergent bilinguals. So first, I'm going to explain that I use the term emergent bilinguals over other terms like English language learners or ELs or limited English proficient, which is a term that really hasn't been used for a long time, to refer to students who use 2 or more languages in their daily lives. So today we're going to be working on 2 distinct activities or ideas. The first part of today is we're going to focus on introducing I'm going to introduce new ways to think about language and language learners, but also really talk about how to do things differently in your classrooms with regard to assessment. So I want to let you know that I'm focusing on reading assessments that happen in elementary schools. But a lot of the ideas and concepts that I'll be speaking about can be extrapolated to other contexts. So if you work in high school or pre-K, for example. So in this first portion of today's afternoon work, we're going to be working on these three things. What are some issues with formative-based classroom assessments for emergent bilinguals? What does the research tell us about how emergent bilinguals read, and how then do we assess them accurately? And lastly, what can teachers do to accurately assess the reading of emergent bilinguals? And I really want to build off those of you who attended Dr. Kate Seltzer's presentation this morning to think about starting with ourselves and starting with our own criticality and reflection about our ideologies. So during this presentation, I hope that you feel, even though it's virtual, that you're able to chat your ideas, to chat some questions. When you see this little green stop sign, I'll also have some ideas some questions that I may want you to think about. So I'll provide opportunities for you to chat, and we'll also have breakout rooms. So the second part of today's afternoon work is then I want us to think about how are the ideas that I'm talking about, how can they take root in your specific environments? So I develop a method of how to adapt assessments. So after reviewing some guiding principles on adapting assessments, I will provide a method of analyzing and adapting assessments for your contexts that I created for this talk. And I'm really excited to share that with you today. So that's just to orient you to what are we doing today and how is it related to your own work. So I start with this wonderful picture of my former student, my Brooklyn College student, and doing a running record. And I also start with a quote from Marie Clay, which is, "There must be times when the teacher stops teaching and becomes an observer, a time when she drops all of her presuppositions about what a child is like, and when she listens very carefully and records very precisely what the child can, in fact, do." And what I love about this quote by Marie Clay is that she's asking teachers to be anthropologists in a way, and to be curious about children and to understand children on their own terms. So as a teacher and researcher, I focused on running records because I was excited about the idea behind formative assessments, which is to truly know your readers. And when you truly know your children as readers, you can develop effective, responsive, and appropriate approaches to them. However, reading assessments are often frequently used to solely determine students' reading levels and to report them to administrators. Teachers are often told which assessments to use, when to use them, who to report results to, and how students should be grouped based on those results. So often the culture on reading assessment feels more test-based than formative. So Liz, Dr. Pignon put a question in the chat, which is, what's an aspect of assessment that you enjoy and why? And I know that sometimes the chat moves slower than the slides, so it's okay if you respond to it on your own terms, on your own paper, or if you put it in the chat. But sometimes we don't talk about what we enjoy about assessment. And I think there's some aspects of assessment that teachers actually enjoy and feel strongly about. So if we look at how formative assessments are defined, according to this definition, they really are defined as instruments to get to know and understand children. So this definition is from the Formative Assessment for Students and Teachers Collaborative, and it's a little old, it's from 2008, but I think it is a strong definition. It's a process, and I like that word, and I use the word process. I bolded it, used by teachers and students during instruction that provides feedback to adjust ongoing teaching and learning to improve students' achievement of instructional outcomes. So the three things that are bolded, process, feedback, and adjustment, I think are really important for teachers to always be close to, because it's not something that ends on a certain day. It's something that continually happens throughout the year. And we may think differently about students' abilities throughout the year. So it's a process. We provide feedback. So it's not something to keep from students, but something to share with students. And it means that our own growth is implicated because we're adjusting our teaching. So what I love is baked into the idea of formative assessment is not only supporting student growth, but really actually even supporting teacher growth, because we become more and more skillful teachers as we adjust our instructional practices based on what we learn. And I just want to highlight a couple of things that I see from the chat. Maura Herrera said, I enjoy celebrating student achievement. And that is so wonderful, because when we're with students as teachers, we have a professional relationship with them in which we see their highs and lows, and to celebrate student achievement is incredible. Natalie said, I learn about student growth and progress. And Maura again wrote, for me, teacher assessment is the next way to know what the next steps are. Yes. Okay. But assessment is also linked to equity and agency. Formative assessments also have purpose towards equity thinking. The current thinking is that formative assessments should be part of a larger process of equity and agency. Both of these slides, which speak to the expansive nature of assessments, stand in contrast, though, to the ways that I experienced assessment as a teacher. I was influenced by the dissonance between my experience and the knowledge that what was valued in schools was really merely reporting. So the dissonance between my experience and my knowledge of the potential and intention of formative literacy assessment was also bolstered by reading statements such as these issued by the National Council of Teachers of English. And I'm just going to read this. NCTE, which is a great organization, often has position papers, and one of the position papers about assessment was about literacy assessment. And they write, literacy assessment is a social process, not a technical activity. Accordingly, all student texts are assessed by knowledgeable humans. So I think what this quote is really speaking to is that assessments are embedded in context, and it's humans, not computers, who are doing the assessment. And therefore, we're looking for holistic view of children. Literacy assessment practices embraces several kinds of diversity, including diversity of languages, learning styles, and rates and routes of learning. Again, because we're doing assessments on children who are all different, that means that our assessments need to be adapted to those differences. And that's what the talk that I'm going to give today is really about in the work that we're doing. But even though there's so much potential in assessment, my day-to-day experience as a teacher was very different from this vision for formative assessments that is aligned to the goals of equity and social justice. In fact, the practices that I engaged in schools ran counter to these ideas. I found the following. In my school, and your school may be different, focused on reporting levels rather than analyzing running record data. It focused on obtaining data about reading in 2 languages separately. It focused on using data to create groupings and identify struggling students. And there was no professional development about seeing students as readers across named languages of programs. So really, I was spending an enormous amount of time in my classroom not teaching, reading with each child in English and Spanish, and in the end, I would hand in a piece of paper with the children's reading levels in English and Spanish, and it took so much time, but I wasn't having the opportunity to actually look at the miscues and think about each child and how were they a reader. So I think that this stands in contrast to the potential. So Dr. Pignon put in another question in the chat. What are some tensions that you find between the intent of assessment and how they're actually implemented. So just like I was explaining, I thought of formative assessments as being very expansive, but yet when I had to implement them, they were implemented in a way in which they were just a test. So something happened to the picture here. I'm sorry. But some questions that emerged from practice were, how do we accurately assess our emergent bilinguals? How do we draw upon students' bilingual resources in reading? And what are some ideologies that govern how assessments are implemented? So from my experience as a teacher and a coach, I had lots of questions, including these. And I realized if I were to look deeply at running records, what would I be looking for in bilingual students? How do students' language practices enter into the assessment process? And as I thought about the work across time, I also thought about the ideologies which govern assessment and how they manifest themselves. So from all of my experience, this was the kind of work that I did during my dissertation and after my dissertation. I also thought about, what do assessments and how they're used in classrooms say about how teachers are positioned vis-a-vis assessments? So I began to think and ask questions about the role of teachers regarding assessments, because assessment practices also affect teachers. Like I said, it takes an enormous amount of time to implement running record assessments three times a year in Spanish and English. So what was the message that I was getting and other teachers were receiving about their role in assessment? And how then do teachers see themselves with regard to assessment? For assessment to truly be effective, what is the role that teachers should play? So in this slide, I have kind of an either or. Are teachers positioned regarding assessments as learning procedures and faithfully following them, just being compliant? Or are we agents in ensuring that assessment meets the needs of students? And obviously in this talk, I believe that we're more towards the side of agents, that we really know students, and in knowing students, we can adapt assessments to truly understand what they know. So now we're going to go into more of research on assessment knowledge of emergent bilinguals. So first, there are some general issues in literacy assessment, regardless if students are bilingual or if they're not. And in my dissertation and subsequent work, I found that many teachers engage in routinized assessment practice rather than observation and analysis. So what I mean by routinized is it becomes a routine. It's something that you just do because you have to do. It's like when you're washing the dishes, like you take a plate, you put soap, and you then rinse it. Formative assessments are really to understand, as we talked about before, to really understand each unique child. But when the pressure is for us to, let's say, produce a list of reading levels, then the process, which is supposed to be part of understanding the unique individual, becomes a routine. And therefore, some of the meaning that should be in the assessment process is not in it. Compliance is valued over the formative nature of literacy assessment process. So instead of teachers thinking, oh, there's, this child read a word differently than I expected, let me figure that out. They may think, well, it's an assessment and therefore I just have to implement it. And so what's valued is my compliance over what I know about the child. And then Serafini, Moses, Kaczorski, and Rilak said, literacy assessment is focused on monomodal performances of reading. So it's just listening and speaking, rather than inserting other things like drawing or interpretation of drawings within a text, for example. So these are some general issues, regardless of if students are bilingual or not. But there are also issues with formative assessment of emergent bilinguals. And a lot of this work was headed by Betty. Jamala Betty teaches in in California, but I forgot what school. And he often said, language and content are confounded through assessment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But language and reading are always connected. But sometimes we need to think about how can we kind of untangle them so that what we're assessing is what we want to assess rather than language proficiency. So if we want to assess reading and reading comprehension, could we do that multilingually, so we understand the comprehension rather than just solely on understanding the proficiency? And I know that's maybe a new idea, and we'll talk a lot about that later. And then formative assessments are often used to evaluate monolingual students along monoglossic standards, which ignores how their multilingualism factors into their learning. So what Shohami is talking about is that a particular assessment may be devised for or assumes that a student is a monolingual English speaker, and therefore the results are premised that the student is going to perform like a monolingual English speaker. But if the student is multilingual, then other factors may be present. Students may have experiences in other languages, may have vocabulary in other languages that just don't show up in that monolingual assessment. And therefore, we may not know what students actually know. So really, when I think about what are some issues for literacy assessment of emergent bilinguals, formative reading assessments, like the running records that I talked about at the beginning, has been a monolingual endeavor across different program types for many, many years. And when I say different program types, I mean either bilingual classrooms or English medium classrooms with lots of emergent bilinguals. So if we're doing a reading assessment in English, we assume that children are going to respond in English to all questions, for example, or perform like a monolingual English speaker. And the same may be true when we do an assessment in Spanish as well, for those of you who do assessments in Spanish. So what are the effects of having a monoglossic assessment on emergent bilinguals? These practices come from accountability measures that are based on external notions of reading and readers and have an enormous effect on emergent bilinguals. So there's a focus on language during reading rather than reading habits, skills, and abilities. And again, I'm separating the idea of that reading can be thought of as a general linguistic skill. So for example, I can read in English, in Italian, and in Spanish. And reading in that general sense means that I can understand plot, I can understand characterization, I can talk about changes in the story. You can do that in any language. And then there's language specific skills. I need to know vocabulary, etc., in order to read in one specific language. So often teachers make every reading experience a focus on language as well. And I think, one way to think about this is, how do teachers think about reading so we can focus on reading as a general skill and also reading in a particular language? There's often an increased number of miscues that leads to a lower reading independent reading level. So if children are making mistakes and or what is called a miscue, but that miscue is related to their language ability, then perhaps those miscues are not really reflective of how they read, but then eventually leads to a lower reading independent reading level. Often we don't understand how students read across languages with their language practices, and inaccurate reading levels can lead to inaccurate groups. So sometimes instruction may be focused on remediation rather than traditional reading instruction for students. And we have another question in the chat. What are some ways that you see the effects of assessments on emergent bilinguals? So again, that's something that you can think about privately, or you can say some ideas in the chat at any time, and we will go back and read them. So as a translanguaging scholar in literacy, I often think, well, what does a translanguaging perspective offer to any aspect of reading instruction, and in this case, on assessment? So I mentioned this at the beginning, but I wanted to say how we view students really matters. So my dissertation advisor, who's Ofelia Garcia, along with Falke and Kleifkin, started using the word emergent bilinguals, or the label emergent bilinguals, in 2008. And that's the term that I use. And I prefer it over English language learner or limited English proficient, and rather use words like emergent bilinguals or multilingual learners for the following reason. Emergent bilinguals really focuses on the bilingualism of children, and emergent refers to that learning language, or being a language user, is always something that happens on a spectrum. So we're always learning language. It's always emerging. We're creating new and dynamic practices. Multilingual learners is another term that I think is very positive and strengths-based, because it also acknowledges that students may know more than 2 or maybe 3 languages. And I think the current thinking now is that these languages do matter in children's lives, and they impact students' academic achievement. So what is translanguaging? I really like to talk about this, because sometimes translanguaging is a concept that has been in vogue and become more and more popular, but there's still a lot of confusion about what it really is, and sometimes can use it as a synonym with something like code switching, when it is different. So translanguaging in its simplest sense is the idea that students or bilingual people have a single social and linguistic repertoire. And this is a picture I took in Chinatown, and it's of, I'll show you to you the complete picture later. It's of a student reading a book. So in Chinatown, this student interacts with, obviously, English, because they go to a school where it's not a dual language Chinese English school, it's an English medium school. And also Spanish, because Chinatown is right next to neighborhoods where there are many Latinx people. So in this diagram, what we want to show is that within this person's, I guess, repertoire, there's English, there's Spanish, there's Chinese, and they all interact together as a single linguistic repertoire. And Ofelia Garcia and Li Wei wrote the following definitions. Translanguaging is how bilinguals call upon different social features in a seamless and complex network of multiple semiotic signs as they adapt their languaging to suit the immediate task. So that's very complex, but in a nutshell, it's shown in this picture. So now you can see the bigger picture. So this student wrote, my favorite book, this is my favorite book because, and then wrote it in Chinese. And I don't think you can see the whole picture, but she wrote the book in Chinese and some of it in English. And it demonstrates a couple of things. Number one, the child was able to engage in this task because she knew that she could use both English and Spanish. So translanguaging was, through translanguaging, she was able to engage in a more complex way in this task. Two, that she realizes that language is used to convey meaning, and therefore, if she wanted to convey meaning, she could use both English and Chinese to express why that was her favorite book. So translanguaging is that ability to use features from all of your linguistic resources in order to make meaning. And so what does translanguaging perspective mean on reading assessment? Um, so, so translanguaging is critical to thinking about assessments because it helps us to understand that to accurately assess emergent bilinguals, we need to know how emergent bilinguals read across languages. Translanguaging has highlighted the essential role that emergent bilinguals' linguistic and social resources have in their learning and in making meaning in classrooms. Readers may hear or read a text in one language, but interact with it deeply using another language. Um, for example, students who read this book, The Rainbow Weaver, about a girl who ends up cleaning up her community may think and express themselves about the text in Spanish or in a combination of English and Spanish, even if the book is read to them in English. So understanding that reading does not have to be equated with language proficiency opens up an understanding that to accurately assess emergent bilingual readers, as teachers, we need to push ourselves towards a multilingual, strengths-based approach to reading assessment. And another example is, again, I read in Italian, but Italian is my most weak language. And if I were to read a book in Italian and you were to ask me a conversation in Italian to talk about it, perhaps you would think that my comprehension was limited because my Italian is limited, but my comprehension may be expansive if I could speak about the book in Spanish or in English, for example. Here's another opportunity for a chat. In what ways, if any, do your students translanguage in your class? Again, feel free to just think about it, to write it down on a piece of paper close to you, or to do it in the chat. And we will get back to those. So there is a lot of hope because there are calls for assessment to shift to embrace the semiotic and linguistic practices of emergent bilinguals. Jamie Schissel, who's in North Carolina, is one of the leaders of this work. And she writes that approaches to testing that incorporate a deficit-based monolingual perspective are set up to be inadequate in creating more equitable testing approaches because they continue to operate within monolingual ideological frameworks that are incongruent with the semiotic and linguistic practices of language minoritized bilinguals. And therefore, she calls for an approach to assessment, which is the opposite, which is more multilingual and assumes that the linguistic practices of language minoritized bilinguals can be an asset in these practices. So just to, I think, emphasize is that a main takeaway that's pretty evident, but in school often is confused, is that reading abilities cannot be equated with language proficiency. Reading needs to be thought of as a process that goes beyond named languages. In addition, we haven't talked about this term, but racialized emergent bilinguals experiences with reading assessment. When I refer to racialized emergent bilinguals, they're students who are students of color. And I think probably Kate Seltzer talked about this. It's not only that reading abilities are sometimes equated with language proficiency, but sometimes they're also equated with who is deemed a reader. Sometimes we assume that children who have certain experiences are better readers than others, and it's associated with, their social context, what kinds of things they do. And I think it's really important that as teachers, we don't make those assumptions as well. So now we're going to shift gears, and I want to demonstrate some of the ways that these ideas have taken root in my own practices. So as a result of the questions that I posed earlier that stemmed from my practice, I engaged in a study alongside teachers in which I explored the ways that teachers inserted a multilingual orientation. And the result that we came up with is something called responsive adaptations. Briefly, these are flexible, knowledge-based ways of responding to students. They're part of a strengths-based perspective of emergent bilinguals. They're not a new set of procedures or uninformed and unconnected to student learning. And again, I'm going to show you some examples related to miscues in a second. So this is something from my co-authored book with Cecilia Espinosa called Rooted in Strength. And what I did is, often as a teacher in professional books I would see about reading, I would say, this is a guide to how you document miscues. And it was always very generic. So I thought, what if we did this and we assumed that the children were bilingual? So I created this annotation sheet, and here this is just a snippet of it. If you want the complete guide, I could it would be in the book. So running record annotation and questions for analysis for emergent bilinguals. So at the very top is, what are some guiding questions? How can I support this child as a reader across linguistic repertoires? And how can I support this child's acquisition of language features across a named language? So again, what I'm trying for teachers to do is think about reading as a general skill and then as related to language. So for example, here in the first one, this is very generic, what all teachers do. When a reader reads each word accurately, they use a tick mark. So when I went home, I ate a cookie. But then here, when the child substitutes a word, there's a little bit of a difference. So the child said aided instead of ate. When I went home, I ate a cookie. So generally what teachers do when students say this is they write the word above the text. But here's the innovation. It's really important for teachers of emergent bilinguals to ask themselves, does the substituted word make sense? Is it a verb? Is it an irregular verb that the student doesn't know? And this is where we're getting into, is this a reading issue or this is a language issue? And someone who's really influenced my work in this arena is Alison Briseno, who's at University of California, San Jose, and Adria Klein, because they really thought about how does language affect the miscues that students have. So did the student drop or add an ED ending? Because this is very common for Spanish speakers. Does the substitution reflect the features of the child's linguistic repertoire, etc.? So these are questions that teachers who specifically teach emergent bilinguals should ask themselves, because it helps us to understand and to tease apart, where is this miscue coming from? So in this particular instance, aided is a miscue, but it may be reflective of a child who doesn't know the verb. It's an irregular verb and added an ed. So what would we do as teachers is we might, instead of we will mark it as a miscue, but maybe pull the child aside and do a lesson, or do to talk to this child and show them that some patterns in verb tenses, for example. So how else can we account for language-related miscues? We can take a closer look at some of these language-related miscues. What I want to highlight with these two examples is that as teachers, one of the most powerful things we can do is we assess our readers is to exhibit a curiosity about how their language diversity impacts their reading. So for example, the student says the word un here. So here, the student may substitute a word in another named language. So for example, you still write the word above the text. When I went home, I ate un cookie. And to think about, it's the same as a. This example demonstrates that the reader is making meaning and sense of the text. The question that is next to this example demonstrates that we're listening to students reading. We're asking, does it make sense? How does the child's reading make sense to them? And I think that's really important because we can think about, oh, they are making sense of this text, but they're inserting a different language. The second type of miscue here, pronounces words differently than the assessor, is really important. So, and this is an innovation, right? P above the word. So when I went home, I ate a cookie. The second example demonstrates that when a student pronounces a word differently from a teacher, it does not necessarily mean that the child is not reading accurately. The question helps us consider these miscues more deeply. So as someone who hears people speaking English who are Spanish speakers, I often hear this, when I went home. So it's hard to hear the difference between went and when. Maybe that's kind of a New York thing, but these types of pronunciation differences between assessors and children happen often. So I think for teachers, it's important to ask, does the pronunciation affect meaning? And how does the pronunciation reflect the student's knowledge of a given name language? Because if the child read the word went, but pronounces as when, it still means that they read it as when, but that we hear it as when. So should we mark it as a miscue when it doesn't affect meaning and it reflects the child's pronunciation? I don't think so. And these are ways that I think teachers can have a very curious and careful ear about miscues. And I'm going to show one more example of how this looks like with a student. So this is not a real student. This is a made-up student that I made up based on my cousin in Colombia named Nubia. And here's a student that I invented for the purposes of seeing how this would work. So she read this book called Frogs and Toads Are Cool Creatures. That's a level J. And if we look carefully at her miscue, you'll see that she does certain types of substitutions. Do you want to learn about frogs eat toads? Let's jump right in. So she substituted E instead of and. Let's start with frogs. Frogs spent it some time in the land. Frogs breathe through their nose, but they also breathe through their skin when they are in water. They have big bulging, and the teacher says bulging, eyes. They have special eyes that help frogs see well when they're in the water. Frogs shut out their long, sticky tongues. Too, and then I cut it off. But what we can see here is a student whose miscues are reflective of a child who is bringing her entire linguistic repertoire when she reads in a new language, which is English. The majority of Nubia's miscues are either substitutions or insertions. When looking at the nature of the substitution, we can ask, does the substitution make sense? And how does it reflect her language development? The first substitution is E in Spanish, and it's a translation of the word in English, and it preserves the exact meaning of the sentence. Nubia says spented for spend by adding an ed to the end of the verb. And there are also words that are pronounced based on her understanding of how sounds sound in her home language, like sticky instead of sticky. As a teacher, going back to the two guiding questions that I presented at the beginning, how to support the reader and how to support the child as a language learner, we can give two types of feedback to the child. For example, I love how excited you were about reading this book, and I saw how you looked at the diagrams and when the book described their noses and skin. Great readers take information from words and diagrams and put them together. One thing I'd like for you to work in terms of your language is on thinking on how letters sound differently in each language and how you can use that to read. For example, I know that I sounds like E in Spanish, so that understanding of that difference is going to help you read and then understand the text better. So as you can see, if I were giving that feedback to students, I would not just focus on their miscue and how their language, their Spanish influences their language related miscues. I would do both. I would talk about their experience as a reader in general, and then and what they're doing, and then also give feedback on their specific knowledge that they need in English or in Spanish to be a reader. So there is a lot there with the responsive adaptations, and this way of looking at miscues is what I adapted alongside teachers and was very different from how I was taught to do miscues. And so I developed something super simple, which is a differentiated miscue analysis form. And in this differentiated miscue analysis form, this is also in the book, but it's also in an article that I wrote for Language Arts. Teachers can document different types of miscues. For example, self-correction, meaning and visual, which is what is typically recorded, but also, is there a syntactical or a language or pronunciation miscue, so that we can be curious about how language is impacting students' miscues. So we're almost getting to the breakout room. Thank you for your patience. I know it's been a lot of information. I want to talk a little bit about other different types of responsive adaptations before you go on into your own work. And so what about other parts of the assessment process? I'm going to very quickly talk about 2 other responsive adaptations that you can make. So here is an example of how a responsive adaptation looks like for the introduction. This is an English as a new language teacher who was reading with a child, and she thought that the student who was a beginner in English needed some background knowledge and some vocabulary. So at the introduction, she provided that to the student. So this is a very simple book called In the Rain, about 2 cousins. One lives, is visiting from Vietnam, and one lives in the United States. And so she printed out a map with the US and Vietnam, and she also highlighted these words that she thought that this child may not know: rain, store, are, and here. Another adaptation that was in this exact same reading was to ask students to write down the comprehension questions in whatever language she wanted to write in. So this particular child who was doing this assessment was a newcomer in the 5th grade. She had interrupted formal schooling. So she was able to write in Spanish, but if you speak Spanish or read Spanish, you can see that, you know, it's not on par with a 5th grader in Spanish. But so another critical feature of the reading assessment process is understanding what students comprehend from a text. So through a translanguaging perspective, we understand that reading comprehension is not pegged to an expression in one language. For example, I can read, as I said, in Italian and express my comprehension in English or Spanish, but it still means I know how to read in Italian. But it places responsibility on the teacher to understand students' expressions, regardless of the language that they're in. This means that we can do a number of things, such as ask for written answers in English or a language other than English, or even ask for recordings. This example does a couple of things. It asks questions in 2 languages, and it allows students to write in whichever language she chooses. And then the teacher, if she or he understands Spanish, will be able to understand it, or gives the teacher an opportunity to gather a translation. And this is another example, and this is similar to the example that I showed before. And this is another 5th grader who was reading, and this is an example of the pronunciation, which is One day when the little boy was going to take his bath, he saw a baby beard on the ground. It had fallen out of the nest. And originally, perhaps the teacher would have marked this as a miscue and as an error, but when we went back and asked the child, what did you mean to say when you said a beard? He pointed to a picture of a bird. So this is the documentation sheet. He actually had a book. And so we were like, oh yes, in Spanish, I sounds like E, so it would sound like beard, even if the child actually meant bird. And just to summarize, here are, this is from my article, in terms of making a comparison between what is generally done in formative assessments and in running records and what responsive adaptations could do. So generally in the introduction to a text, a teacher might provide an introduction to the text monolingually, or the teacher asks the students about their prior knowledge monolingually. If you're and I'm only assuming Spanish at this moment. If you know Spanish and you work in a bilingual classroom, or if you work in a monolingual classroom but no Spanish, teachers can make culturally relevant connections using English and the home language to the text. And they can elicit prior knowledge through English and the home language, or both. So another way of adapting an assessment is listening and documenting to student reading. And we talked a lot about this. Students listen to and document student reading for miscues and fluency monolingually in general. But teachers, when they're doing responsive adaptations, can actually create columns for language and pronunciation in addition to traditional miscues. So we can talk about pronunciation, etc. During the retell, in general, teachers ask students to retell texts monolingually, but through responsive adaptations, teachers can invite students to retell the text in both English and the home language, or both. And when we provide feedback to students in general, teachers usually just relate their impressions of their reading and give them a reading level, like, oh, you did a great job. This is a level D. Now you can start choosing level D books. But through responsive adaptations, teachers can provide feedback, like I demonstrated, that target both students' reading ability across languages and also speak to language features. So in the chat, Liz put in, which adaptations would you like to try? And again, even though we have 2.5 hours today, there is so much to talk about. And so this was pretty quick. If you want to find out more information, I would ask you to read my 2018 article in Language Arts on responsive adaptations. Okay, so before we go into the breakout rooms, I just want to review 4 big ideas. The first one, formative assessment tools are powerful for teachers and students and can be especially powerful to understand emergent bilinguals. You know, I related that I loved the opportunity to read with each of my students. I love seeing their growth, and it also helps you to get a holistic portrait of your emergent bilinguals. But formative assessments, as Betty said, when confounded with language, provide teachers with an inaccurate read on emergent bilingual students. So here I put that little yarn. You might have to untangle what is reading, what is their reading, and what is their language proficiency. So sometimes teachers or assessments can have a problem of confusing mastery with language mastery. So the example on the other side of this math test is it's a math problem, and the word one is used as a pronoun to refer to the spinner on the page. So it says, to win a game, Tamika must spin an even number on a spinner identical to the one shown below. Well, if the student is learning English and it says to, identical to the one shown below, does that mean one, the number, or does it mean one, like the one, the pronoun? So in recognizing one among unknown words, the child may deduce that the spinner's arrow must fall on the 1. So in this case, this is really clear. Are we testing math, or we're testing the student's language? And this can happen in many contexts, in particular with reading. Translanguaging provides the foundation for understanding a multilingual perspective on assessment that's demonstrated. And the last big idea is responsive adaptations are ways that teachers can adapt assessments to capture the knowledge and skills of emergent bilinguals. So this child who's in 5th grade who has interrupted formal education, we could understand that she understood the book even though she couldn't express herself in English. So how do we move forward? I really believe that two-pronged change is needed. What I propose and what I'd like to work with you today is on 2 types of changes. What I've learned from sharing this work with others is that it's not the actual changes to the assessment tool that are important and necessary, but we also need to focus on our own internal changes about how we think about assessment and how we communicate that understanding to others. So that's why I have a brain on one side and teamwork on the other. So we're going to stop and process. In breakout rooms, I want you to have the opportunity to consider these ideas. First, what are your own beliefs about formative assessment and emergent bilinguals? What are the practices at your school? What next steps may you take in favor of strengths-based multilingual formative assessments? And with that, I'm going to release the first handout. I'm going to share it with all of you. I hope that you received it. It just says share. The handout, what I would like for you to do with this handout, you don't have to fill it out all right now. I'm going to give you about 12 minutes to do it. What you can do in your groups is you can take some time to get some water, do what you need to do, look at the handout, fill in portions of it, and begin to have a conversation about this handout is really about 3 things. Number 1, where do you stand? What are your beliefs about formative assessment, and how did those beliefs develop? Where do we stand as a school? And you may not be able to do this specifically now, just by yourself, but how is ongoing formative assessment intentionally used to inform instruction in your classroom or at your school, and in what ways? And then attuning formative assessment to emergent bilinguals. What are some steps you can take or your school can take to ensure that formative assessments are tuned to the profiles and needs of emergent bilinguals, etc. So these questions are very meaty, so you may not get to all of them, but what I would ask you to do is consider 1 or 2 and then share it out with others. Again, I'm going to give you 12 minutes so you can use the first, 5 minutes to take a little break, because I know it's been a lot of information, and then come together and have a good 7 minutes to talk to others. Okay, so if you would like to, and Dr. Pignon, I have a Google document with this worksheet. So either she or I can put it in the chat, and if you would rather work on make a copy for yourself, you can do that as well. Okay, so I will do that right now. I want to make sure that you get that copy before you go. And while you guys are in your breakout rooms, I will take a minute also to, and let me know if this works. I will take a minute to read all the chat, because I saw the chat was on fire and I wasn't able to read it while I was talking. So our plan, one last time, is about a 12-minute breakout room. First 5 minutes to do your own thing, attend to your needs, and then the last 7 minutes to introduce yourselves, maybe work on some of the questions together. And again, This resource is very meaty, so I don't expect you to do it all now, but for it to serve as a resource, maybe for your own thinking in the future or for conversations at school. So I will start you in breakout rooms. Hi, everybody. I think I closed the breakout rooms. Welcome back. I let you in the breakout rooms for a little bit longer. It took me a little while to get into the breakout rooms, and then I saw some people were just starting. As I said, it was for the breakout rooms that I did get to visit. It was such a pleasure to meet you during these virtual events. What's so lovely is we get to interact with new people from across the country and the world, and I love hearing about your individual contexts. It was wonderful to meet the few people that I did. And to put a face behind this afternoon. So the second part of this afternoon, and I hope that your breakout rooms were helpful, that you got to meet new people, that you got to think about some of the questions on the handout. As I said, I think that the handout is much too big to do. It was much too big to do in like a 15-minute chunk, but I hope that you take it with you and maybe work on it with colleagues. I see that Liz wrote, it was great talking with Sandra Acosta and Maria Silvia Hernandez, and we spoke about validation. I actually visited that breakout room and I think that one of my efforts in doing this research, just like you, when I explained my story, was that I had been part of this tension between loving formative assessments, but then being caught in a system where I was being told what to do and knowing that it was not exactly the right thing to do for emergent bilingual students. And therefore, really wanted to come up with a way of centering multilingualism within assessment. So what are we doing now in this second part of the afternoon? First, I want to talk about some general principles of adapting assessments through a translanguaging perspective, and then talk about what you can do. And so there'll be a working session so you can actually have something to carry over for the fall when you go back to work with your kids. So we talked about the need for change, and I love this comic. I was introduced to this comic by the wonderful Dr. Kate Mahoney, who works on assessments too. And here it says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And you see, obviously, there are animals that are not adapted to climb anything, like the goldfish. But then we have the monkey who's going to ace that test, the seal who will never get past the roots. So we see that this test was created for a certain type of animal, not for all of them, but a certain type. And so this is an extreme example of what happens every day in schools, especially for our multilingual learners. So as I said, I shared a lot of this work across the country with teachers and students. And one of the teachers who worked with me and who I call Ella, that's a pseudonym, so she can remain anonymous, did a professional development session with teachers at her school. Her school was not a bilingual school or did not have a bilingual program. She was the ENL teacher. And when she talked about responsive adaptations to the faculty, there were some teachers who were vocally opposed to making the adaptations because they thought that they made the assessment invalid and meaningless. So this is what she wrote to me in an email. I explained that it is a test designed for monolingual students, and if we don't make some of these adaptations and be flexible in our thinking, we're penalizing these students and not recognizing the skills they do have. And I raise this because it is so important. It's become clear to me that equity in assessment can not only be achieved by tweaking assessment tools, but also requires interrogating the ideologies that shape assessment and are shaped by them. And this work has been in tandem with Kate Seltzer, who you met this morning. So today, alongside talking about assessments adapting assessments, we'll also talk about how to confront these differences in thinking. So again, responsive adaptations, it's not a procedure. In my heart, as a teacher, and now as a teacher who teaches in higher education, I think teachers are intellectuals, and therefore I'm not providing you with a step-by-step, do this A, B, C, and D. I want teachers to have profound knowledge so that they can take into account students' language practices during an assessment. They can construct an accurate picture of students' knowledge, skills, and abilities, and see their language repertoire as a source of strength. And to do that, I want to talk about some of the common ways we currently talk about assessments. So when I was a teacher, I was also a literacy coach. In New York City, we have literacy coaches, which are teachers who don't have their own classroom, but what they do is they travel from class to class, observing and working with teachers to kind of improve literacy instruction across the school. But because I was out of the classroom, I was used during standardized tests to proctor exams, and that's where I became familiar with accommodations. So accommodations are often given to emergent bilinguals in the following ways: extended time, bilingual dictionaries and glossaries, and a separate location. So basically, when we had the New York State standardized tests, I would be given 5 students in a room far away, and we would be there for time and a half, which is, let's say the test is 60 minutes, you get 90 minutes. And that's extended time. In the middle of the table were some dictionaries and glossaries. And again, we were in a room that the students have never seen, that no one uses, where they could stay there for that period of time. So what did I see when I was proctoring these exams? Number one, students didn't take all the time that they had, because if you just don't know, or you don't have the language proficiency to do the test, the extra time is not helping you. Bilingual dictionaries and glossaries. I rarely saw the children touch the bilingual dictionary or glossary in the middle of the table. Why? Because I don't think they were taught to use them or didn't see them as useful in taking the test. And the separate location possibly could help because it reduces distraction. But what research has shown is often these accommodations are too broad and general to target and improve the linguistic demands of an assessment. So if you're an emergent bilingual who's just learning English, extended time bilingual dictionaries at a separate location will help you not at all or minimally. And I think that it's important for teachers to understand this, because when you are confronted with other teachers or administrators who say, well, you can't adapt the assessment, but we're giving extended time, that you can speak to the effectiveness of something like these accommodations. Next, what about validity? A lot of teachers will talk, well, that's not valid. Another question that you may ask yourself is, what about validity? We hear about this term, but often in professional development, we don't know how it applies to our current practices. So on one side, I have the way validity is often thought of by educators, which is a test valid? And they're thought of as discrete practices that are divorced from context instead of being focused on diverse and dynamic profiles of students. Teachers sometimes express that they have to be faithful to the assessment, and they feel obligated to conduct assessments monolingually. But one of my favorite researchers on assessment, Bador, writes the following, and I think this is really important. Single language measures ignore the fact that bilingual children may choose to use different words depending on the setting and context. So what that means is, on the new side of how validity is thought of, the newer way that validity is thought of by scholars is that it is based on score use. The ways that we use the test and scores. Is this valid for emergent bilinguals? So validity is the soundness in what the assessment measures, what it intends to do. It doesn't mean a fidelity to testing procedures. What it does mean, and I think the new understanding, is are we using the test and scores? Is this valid for emergent bilinguals? So one other concept I want to talk about is measuring content and language proficiency. And we talked a little bit about this in part 1 of this afternoon. Is one way to think about this is understanding that each of these things is considered a construct. So that's a psychometric term. A construct is a concept that we want to measure. So the categories on the side are discrete and should be measured separately. There's bound to be some error because assessment is not perfect, but we need to make sure that the error is as low as we can make it. When we work towards analyzing and adapting assessment, we're being more precise about what we set out to measure and how we're measuring and collect more accurate data about emergent bilinguals. So in one bucket, we may measure language proficiency. So if we want to know how students are learning English or Spanish, we may do a test that focuses specifically on English or Spanish acquisition. But if we want to measure something like reading or skill level in reading, academic achievement, or something like math, then we have to design assessments that measure that construct. If we want to measure reading, and reading is a big thing, reading is decoding, comprehension, there's cultural factors, everything, then we need to design an assessment that goes beyond language and measures reading, that measures reading. I wanted to mention one other thing because lately this has been in the news, and I know that districts are really thinking about this, which is the science of reading. And this talk is not about the science of reading, but I want to give it some time because I know it's on people's minds. I want to highlight a paper issued by the National Committee for Effective Literacy. It's called Towards Comprehensive Effective Literacy Policy and Instruction for Emergent Bilinguals, and it was written by some of the top bilingual education researchers in the country. And I wanted to highlight 2 quotes from that paper, which I think is really interesting. And Miss Liz Pignon, I didn't put we can find the link for it because I think it would be interesting for everyone here to have it. They write, too often one-size-fits-all approaches leave some children behind. And if we think about, this reminds me of one of the breakout rooms. If we think about only having monolingual English-focused reading policies, I was taking notes when I was in the breakout room. Someone said, and I forgot your name, she said, you know, too often children are languishing in intervention programs because the programs were not designed for language learners and not ultimately supporting the growth of students. So it may have an initial impact and bump, but then in the end, it may not. In the long run. And effective literacy instruction for English learners, emergent bilinguals, is different in significant ways from instruction for monolingual students. So one of the things that I want to connect to the science of reading is that it's really still in development in thinking about how it applies to emergent bilinguals. That's really important. That, you know, we can't say that all the research that has been done on phonemic awareness and phonics on English speakers means that we'll see the same approaches will lead to the same effects in bilingual learners. But this talk is not about the science of reading, and but it is on the use of assessment. And assessment is key to reading instruction and to the science of reading. If we are going to use assessment, we need to use data based on what the actual students. So when students are emergent bilinguals, teachers need to have assessment knowledge to make sure that the assessments truly capture what they intend to for emergent bilinguals. I know that was a lot on the science of reading, but I know it's on people's minds, so I wanted to mention it. So we need to think about understanding assessment. We need to think about, how do we imagine what reading is? How does reading exist for schools and for emergent bilinguals? So what is reading and how is it connected to students' language practices? One of the, I guess, critiques I have about the science of reading is they're really focused on decoding. And decoding is truly important, and it's important for everyone. But it's not the whole picture of reading. We need complex ideas of what reading means, and complex ideas of what it means for bilingual students. And how does it match our vision for emergent bilingual students? How do what we do in schools, how does our reading instructional practice match up with our vision for our teaching of reading? Now, from having my own children, I see that reading is always growing and evolving. I put some pictures here of Discord, Twitch, Scratch, actual texts, because my children, who are now preteens, are actually using apps like Discord and Twitch to read and write in ways that when I was a child, I did not. So ignoring that children have these other repertoires means that we don't acknowledge the different ways that they read in their youth-based communities and in with their families, whether it's going to church or having other social practices where reading and writing also take center stage. So how is reading and vision enacted in schools? Just like I said previously, I often believe that it's now a routinized process for both students and teachers, and it becomes more and more this way. In one of the breakout rooms, one of the teachers was saying that the running records, in particular the Fountas and Pinnell that's being used, is enacted in such a kind of routinized way that students see the formative assessment as a test. And when they're timed, it feeds into their anxiety. And my reaction was, what message are children getting about what reading is when they see that the assessment of reading is like a test and they're being valued for pace and for answering specific questions? So sometimes reading, the way we implement it in school, even though this is not the way we may think it is often implemented as a rule-based process, an activity that can be seen as neutral and external to teachers and to students. This is the best practice to teach reading, and if it means that they have issues, rather than thinking about their different routes to learning to read, and we need to find those ways. So we need to see often beyond the smokescreen of best practices. So I would like to propose an alternative way of how reading is envisioned. So the framing has paved the way for monolingual reading pedagogies to have an uncontested stronghold in literacy instruction. It's widely accepted that reading in English is taught separately from reading in other languages, and biliteracy development occurs through the natural transfer between language and relies on what's deemed native language proficiency. And this has a large impact on assessment and how educators believe assessments can work. So the alternative framework is based on these researchers, Compton and Lilly. So reading is really a complex and multidimensional process that includes language, social participation, cultural membership, and identity negotiation. Reading is a meaning-making process that's centered in the person, and who a reader is shaped by a conceptualization of reading and readers. So lastly, I want to talk about what's behind the curtain. It's, as I said before, it's not so simple that making changes to an assessment, but we also need to realize that there are beliefs behind the curtain which allow monolingual practices to continue. Kabuto, my colleague at Queen's College, wrote the following: only English policies help students to learn English faster and assimilate into U.S. culture. Therefore, we should test in English. That's one of the things that is believed. She's not advocating for that. She's saying people then believe, oh, we have to only test in English because they're going to learn English faster. Oh, and Mancilla Martinez, these are researchers at Vanderbilt University, report that students' bilingualism is often seen by educators as a liability to literacy development. So it confirms the belief that emergent bilinguals have fewer skills and knowledge than others. So they surveyed a tremendous amount of teachers, and they found that many teachers think that bilingualism is really hindering literacy development, and that therefore students have fewer skills and knowledge. So I think we need to acknowledge that these are not the beliefs that we have, but are beliefs that circulate and are very popular in schools, and therefore may pose a challenge to when we, as teachers and educators, advocate for adapting assessments. And so we need to work on two levels. One is adapting assessments so we better understand our students, but also counteracting some of these beliefs that teachers may have about bilinguals and bilingualism and how language is acquired. So a translanguaging stance, which you heard about if you attended Dr. Seltzer's morning session, is a philosophical, ideological belief system that teachers draw upon to form their or develop their pedagogical framework. So the focus is on students' language resources and practices, and also on how students are conceptualized and situated because of their language practices. So what we're going to do is I'm going to work with you and show you. Again, I have another handout, and you don't need to do it while. You don't need to do it while. Oops. Sorry. Shared. Okay. I'm just sharing the handout right now. You don't need to do it while I'm talking through this, but you can if you'd like, and you'll have time in the breakout rooms to do this. Again, it's really what works for you. So Liz, I think we'll put the new handout in the chat if you'd like to make a Google copy of it, or if you'd like to just download the handout, whatever works for you. So I created a template for us to use today to think about the process of adapting an assessment. You can do this while I go through the assessment instrument, or you can try it out later, depending on your learning style. So let's move on. So the first step is, what formative assessment would you like to adapt? So this is something that I imagine like a teacher could do during the summer, like now. It could be the running record assessment, or it could be, if you think about the different types of assessments that you do. When I was a teacher for young, I'm still a teacher, but when I was a teacher of young children, I taught kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and then I was a literacy coach within an elementary school. But as a second grade teacher, where I spent most of my time, I would do assessments in math. I would do assessments after a social studies unit. We did, since I live in New York City, we'd always study the ocean since we are right next to the ocean. And I love that ocean unit. We would study the boroughs. So all of these provide opportunities for you to think about, what assessment do you want to adapt? Is there something that's burning in you? Like, I want to try a math assessment that's multilingual. Or even though I'm a literacy person, I'm fine with whatever you choose to do. Or I want to do a writing assessment. Think about, what assessment do you want to adapt and why it has meaning for you. And what do you use it for? It could be an assessment that you're mandated to do, although those are hard. I know, like teachers are doing computer-based assessment like DIBELS, that there really is very little room for you to adapt. But think about a formative assessment where you can have some agency and adapt it. So I'll show you how that worked for me. So for, as I told you, I was in love with reading assessments. So I wanted to adapt a reading assessment. And why? I knew it just bugged me so much as a teacher and then as a literacy coach. I was like, why do we keep on going through the motions and we don't use their language resources to read? like, I know that they do that, but we're not able to do it on assessments. And I'm telling you, it was years and years that I was thinking about this, and it took me a long time to actually do something about it, to really investigate it. And what did I use reading assessments for? I used them to report to administration, but I knew I would like to use them more for instruction. Because as I said very frequently, as a dual language teacher with 26 kids in one classroom, that meant that I was doing 52 assessments 3 times a year. That's enormous. I was having kids at centers. I don't know. I was doing everything possible to get those done. And when I was finished, I was just so happy to be like, here, I'm done. Here's my list. Here are the kids. And then the administration would look at it. But I was so done. I had used every preparatory period, as we say in New York, every prep, every center time, that I was hungry now to then get in and do conferences with my kids, etc. So I wanted to know, how could I use them for instruction rather than, being this like mighty little mouse getting all this stuff done. So on your handout, that's part 1. Then the next part are, who are your emergent bilinguals in your classroom? I always say this, every year is so different. Every year it's, maybe your context is not the same, but I think the world always changes. We've known that now after the pandemic, our world has very much changed. But in my school in Brooklyn, you would think that the child population would remain the same, but it really varied. And I worked there for about 12 years. When I first got there, New York City has a large Caribbean population, Puerto Ricanos, Dominicanos, who live in New York City, in Brooklyn, Upper Manhattan, etc. When I got there, the majority of children were Caribeños. When then we got a large influx of Mexican immigrants. We had a large influx of students from Guatemala, from South America. We also had African American students. We had Afro-Latinx students. And near the end of my 10 years there, we started getting a lot of students who were had interrupted education. Well, at the beginning, we didn't. So that's all to say that sometimes you may think, oh, I teach Latinx students or I teach blank students, but the demographics of those students changes all the time. At least it did for me. So what some students may have known 10 years ago, maybe these students have a different knowledge base. So what do you know about their language resources? What do you know about their literacy practices? And what would you like to find out? One population that's often not thought about or in the literature, but is very prevalent, are people like me who grow up in the US and speak Spanish. So we had lots of students whose parents are Latinos and their children grew up in let's say New York or Texas or Pennsylvania, and they grew up hearing both languages. And they're different from students who are immigrants because their language practices from the very beginning are often bilingual, especially if they have older brothers or sisters. So how did I fill out this portion for myself? I know that my students were Latinx from Brooklyn, second generation, mixed language repertoires with older siblings. We often don't talk about how family composition affects language because usually the youngest child has the most English because their older brothers and sisters speak English with their friends. Immigrants from Mexico, Central America, and a few from South America. What did I know about their language practices? A lot of my students attended religious instruction in church. So they were familiar with church texts. A lot of my students heard a lot of stories, myself included. When I was little, more than books, I heard stories that my mom told me of growing up in Boyacá, Colombia. So I believe that those are important texts that we often don't consider when we're thinking about children's literacy practices. And what would I like to find out? I wanted to find out how their diverse language practices, how they use them while they were reading in my class. So if they were reading in church, for example, or hearing their mom tell them stories, how did that come to bear on my instruction? And the third point in this handout is what is the purpose of the assessment? This is something I really learned from Dr. Kate Mahoney, is why are you giving this assessment? We need to be very clear. Is it for instruction? Is it for student learning? Is it for reporting? What is the purpose of this assessment? What do you want it to do? And given the purpose, what does this mean about how you invite language practices and modalities within the assessment? So if the purpose of assessment is to assess English learning, for example, let's say, or Spanish speaking, let's say I want to see how the children in my dual language bilingual second grade classroom speak Spanish and can have a conversation, then I write that that's the purpose, to assess Spanish oral language ability. So given that purpose, do I allow them to speak English? I probably would not encourage them to speak English. I would, because I want to find out about their Spanish. But for example, if the purpose of my assessment is reading in Spanish and understanding their overall comprehension, then sure, I'm going to listen to them read in Spanish. But then if I want to know about their comprehension, as we talked about in the past, then I'm going to invite multilingualism in there. So given the purpose, what does this mean about the method that you use? So we often think about in school, it's all about talking and listening and reading and writing, but is there another method? Is there drawing? Can students construct something? I think it's important. But method also refers to, like, is it multiple choice? Is it speaking into a recorder? Is it the kids writing something on a Google Classroom? What is it? Because we need to make sure that there's alignment between the purpose, what modalities, and the method that you then create. So for my adaptation on reading, I thought I wanted to assess comprehension, fluency, decoding. I wanted to develop guided reading groups, and I wanted to monitor and report. So you can see that I had 3 purposes. So given this purpose, I wanted to insert opportunities for students to use their language practices during the entire assessment. And this doesn't only have to do for English and Spanish. A funny story is nearby, there's in New York City, there's populations from everywhere, but there's a French population in the neighborhood near where I live. And the French population from France created a dual language bilingual program in French and English. And it attracted so many people. All of a sudden, everybody heard, oh, there's this French English dual language program. So Canadians from the French speaking parts of Canada came, like all these people. And I was observing teachers doing running records there. And I remember one teacher reading a book about tortillas to a French speaking student. And she said, do you know what tortillas are? And I was like, this is so funny. And the student was like, no. And she's like, they're like crepes. They're crepes. And I thought, wow, these adaptations are important for multilingual learners, regardless of what the language they speak, because obviously children from different cultures will need support to understand specific words. So I got such a kick out of it because for me, tortillas are very common and for the students I usually work with. So it was funny to see the teacher making that adaptation. And given the purpose, what does this mean about the method that you use? So continue with the majority of a running record being oral, but insert written elements and multimodal elements if they make sense. So And the last part are responsive adaptations. So if you're working through this, and if you chose an assessment, think about the different parts of it. You know, if it's a math exam, maybe the first instructions could be given in multiple languages. So what are the test instructions? What are the word problems, etc. So think about what are the different parts of the assessment? How do you generally do it? And how are you going to tweak it? So again, just to provide the example of how I did it. So the introduction to the text. Usually teachers just talk monolingually. This book is called Rice, and it is about how children eat rice all over the world. What do you know about rice? But instead, teachers can make culturally relevant connections using English and the home language to the text. This book is called Rice. I often call it arroz. What do you call it? How do you eat it? Etc., etc. Creating a cultural connection that is not what happens, but I think could be very powerful for students, since researchers have shown that the cultural relevance of a text improves students' comprehension. Okay, we're ready for our second breakouts, and I'm eager to get in and interact with you and see what you're thinking. So for this breakout, I want you to adapt an assessment for emergent bilinguals to local contexts. And now, after 1.5 hours of knowing me, you know that it's not that I want you to complete it. I want you to engage in the ideas. So I'm not going to give you time this time to kind of get a glass of water if you can, of course, if you want, but I would love to get right into it. In your groups, it would be great if you could introduce yourself, talk about any insights about going through this process. What's one thing you may do to adapt an assessment that you currently use? What challenges do you anticipate? And what are some ways you can talk to others about it? So I'm going to stop right there. I went a slide ahead. So I'm going to put you in breakout rooms. I think from what I learned from last time is that like 7 minutes is too little. We'll do about 15 minutes. And again, you can introduce yourselves, talk about this process. What's one assessment that you would like to adapt, and what challenges you'd like that you would anticipate, and how would you address those challenges? So I'm about to put you in break. I will see some of you there. Welcome back, everybody. Wait a couple of seconds. I know I'm not familiar with this platform, but on Zoom, I know that it takes people a couple seconds to get back into the main room. So welcome back. Again, I got to go into a couple of breakout rooms, and I was really excited to hear your conversations. So if there's anything that you'd like to share, you can put it in the chat. That's something that happened in your breakout room that you were discussing. I heard some about validation, about bringing forward some of these ideas and conversations with your professional learning communities, challenging yourself to think about why are you engaging in a specific practice and a specific assessment. I hope that the handouts and the talk today really helped you, if not flesh out an entire self-reflection or assessment, are just the baby steps for you to start thinking about these ideas, maybe start thinking about what are your ideologies about assessment, what are some steps that you're willing to take. And now what we're going to talk about is then how can you move forward and bring these conversations to your peers or to your school community if you feel like you would like to. So often teachers are taught that they can just close the door and do what they want. But that means that those children under your care are getting the thoughtful practices that you're thinking about, but then the wider school community may not know about why you're doing what you're doing and the innovations that you're creating. And I wanted to resurrect this slide. So as we come to the end of the talk, I wanted to remind everyone that it's not so simple to just tweak an assessment and we're done and hide behind the classroom door. We need to share and dialogue with others about the work that we do so we can understand it and own it and share it with others. So another person that's really influenced me is Dr. Trish Morita Mullaney. And she talks about, she was a district official, and she talks about how teachers, administrators, and teacher leaders don't have conversations. And so there's a lot of misunderstandings about what's going on. So I would like to encourage you to think about having conversations with colleagues about assessments. So let's say that that's you on my left. I'd like to use responsive adaptations with my assessments. And a teacher may say, isn't that unfair for English speaking students? And to think about, what would you respond? How would you explain, given what you've learned today, about why it's not, just like Ella did, and saying, well, it's a monolingual assessment constructed for monolingual students. So multilingual students may need adaptations so that their linguistic resources can demonstrate how they read, for example. The principal may ask, what are responsive adaptations and how do you explain that? What resources do you give to a principal so that they may understand these concepts? So that 2018 article where I introduced responsive adaptations that Liz Pignon put in the chat like an hour and a bunch ago, I actually wrote thinking that that's what I wanted it to serve as. I wanted it to serve as a way for teachers to say, hey, I read this article, and give it to a principal. So it's peer-reviewed, research-based, but also very friendly for all educators to read. Because I often think that, and we talked about this in one of the breakout rooms, that the mandates are pushing and creating teacher behaviors. So I'm going to be assessed on this, and therefore you have to do this. And then the children are the ones who are getting one-size-fits-all instructional procedures when we all know that children don't need that. So I would like for you, and again, we don't have very much time, so this is just an invitation, to think about that it's critical not only to tweak assessments, but to find the reasons that are important to you to why assessments and adapting assessments is important, and how would you talk about it with colleagues and administrators. So, this is something you can think about when you're in the car, walking someplace. Think about what are some ways you would explain the need for responsive adaptations to other teachers or even administrators. So I want to leave some time for questions as well. But as I end, there are two big key takeaways. The first one is that as teachers, we need to push ourselves and build a knowledge base about the assessment of emergent bilinguals. So really thinking about, what is the difference between assessment of content and assessment of language? And for me in particular, in reading, what are general reading skills and what are specific reading, language-specific reading skills? And be aware of the results of the inaccurate assessment of emergent bilinguals. How does this affect them? Then to develop research-informed ways to adapt formative assessments. So how do we push ourselves to draw upon students' multilingual and multimodal repertoires during assessment, and to study your formative assessment process and to find opportunities to provide responsive adaptations. And lastly, always to share your thinking and work with colleagues. First, you might want to share your work with colleagues that are like-minded and can help you think about it, and then with the broader community. So this is just if you're interested in reading more. Dr. Kate Seltzer and I wrote an article. This one is a meaty one, always at the bottom, Ideologies in the Assessment of Emergent Bilinguals. And we merged our interests together in writing this article, with my interest in assessment and her work on critical translingual lens. And so you can see it's like the child of two interests. And then this article, I'm really interested not only in assessment, but also in reading instruction in general. So Rebecca Quinones was a student, a master's student in my program. And after she graduated, I asked her if I could spend time in her classroom every week for years. And so Rebecca Quinones became my co-researcher and co-writer. She's a second grade teacher in Brooklyn, New York. And we wrote an article about guided reading and bilingualism. And you can find that in the Reading Teacher. That article is very teacher friendly in that it's not like you feel like you're in grad school and underlining. It's more of like, you know, something that you could read in a shorter period of time and you're not like, oh, this is so wordy. And then there's Translanguaging and Responsive Adaptations, the article that originally introduced these ideas of responsive adaptations. And then the book that I wrote with my very good friend, Cecilia Espinosa, Rooted in Strength, where we bring together she works on writing and I work on reading, and we write all about translanguaging within balanced literacy in reading and writing instruction. So with that, if you're interested, those are things to explore more. I would love to hear your questions, ideas, next steps, anything that you'd like to write in the chat. I have been reading the chat, but I don't know if there are any other questions. So put them in and I will address them. I'm just looking at the chat. Linda Quiles, I'm glad that you find the resources helpful. Again, you can bring them to your school and work with them in collaboration with others. Let's see. I was in a breakout room with Ashley Zimmerman, but earlier in their chat, she said that she'd like to try out retelling in both languages and the introduction to the text. So let me know if you don't have questions now. And I know now 2.5 years on Zoom and virtual platforms, it's sometimes hard to think of questions at the end, but you might think of questions later. I have here my Brooklyn College email and my Twitter handle at Ascenzi-Moreno. I'm pretty active on Twitter, so if you'd like to follow me there, or you could write me a message and I will write you back. You know, I love interacting with teachers and with people who want to move forward. So please, if you think of another question in the future, I'm happy to answer you at any time. Maura Herrera just wrote, do you recommend some Spanish assessment for the levels O through Z? EDL is only until level N. Now, that is a great question, Maura. I don't think I'm not going to recommend any specific Spanish kit, but I am going to tell you a tiny story, which is when I was a teacher I'm going to pull out my cane. When I was a teacher in the early 2000s, there were very few kits in Spanish, and so we constructed our own. So I know that that may sound really daunting, but it gives you an advantage in several ways. Number one, you can pick non-translated texts for Spanish from O to Z, and you can choose texts that match the dialects of the students in your particular school. So like I said, we had lots of Caribeños, and the Spanish is very different from South American, Central American, Mexican Spanish. And so you may be able to find texts, because we didn't talk about that, but like sometimes I had students who were Dominican reading a book that was produced in Mexico, and they're like, what are they talking about? You know, Latin America, the region is very huge, and language diversity is there too. So I know that's probably not the answer that you were looking for, but in the old days, there was the Fountas and the Pinnell book that described each level and what were the characteristics of a level O, and we would then look at a book and match the book to that level. So the other thing, Maura, I wanted to say, and I said I wasn't going to do this, but I would look at the American Reading Company. It's not a big company, but I know that they work really hard to make sure that their texts are non-translated texts. Cambri Ibarra, do you post your articles on Twitter? Yes, sometimes I do. So there is another article that I didn't talk about, which is from Literacy Today, which is a great one-pager that you can print out and give to colleagues. And I really, as someone who works in schools and is a teacher at heart, I often think about how do I produce things that are not like just for people doing their doctorates and like burning the midnight oil, but like for people who are busy and want just quick information. And so that Literacy Today article is on Twitter too. Any other questions? I'm happy to answer. And again, it could be now or it could be in the future. It's the summer, so I may take a little longer than during the year, but I'll definitely get to your question if you ask me through those medium. Anyway. I am so honored. It was such a delight to be with you. I wish we were all together. Actually, it would mean that it would be fewer people, but I truly enjoyed presenting and working with you. I loved going to the breakout rooms. Thank you for everything.
Bravo, Doctora Ascenzi-Moreno. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Again, thank you so much. It was such an honor to be invited to speak at this conference. Thank you to the IDRA leadership, and in particular, Liz Pignon, who invited me and has really developed this whole series on translanguaging. Thank you.
Bravo. Vamos por más.
And there's so many great people in the coming days.
Yes,
it's very exciting. So Fabiola, do you end the workshop, or do I have to end it?
You can end it, Dr. Ascenzi-Moreno.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. I have to know. Let me see. Where did I go?
Okay. Happy travels.
Guess what? I got a text while I was presenting that the flight is delayed until 11 p.m. Let's hope